السلام عليكم. الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. One of the most commonly discussed and debated topics among people today is homosexuality. It is a topic of controversy among the religious and topic of politics and social rights among the secular and homosexual supporters. We have even had individuals asking about Islam's position on the topic in our recent open houses in the Open Mosque Day in our local mosques. The definition of homosexuality is something everyone knows about, which is a sexual relationship between people of the same sex. Hence, no further description is required. However, what is significant is that in recent years, it has gotten a lot of media attention, especially in the West, followed by other parts of the world who tend to follow Western culture. In the West, the gay community has come out along with various rainbow coalitions, identifying themselves as part of the larger community. And through their strong lobby, they have pushed for equal rights, including same-sex marriage, which is now legalized in 37 states in the U.S. and in 30 countries around the world, according to Pew Research, mostly in Europe and Americas. Even certain churches and priests have allowed and performed the gay marriage ceremonies. In some Muslim communities, there have even been articles written by gay Muslims or their supporters, and a scholar in Europe who has endorsed it. So, the issue of homosexuality has many aspects today in the Western as well as some Eastern countries, not just in the social but religious and political aspects. Many debates are ongoing within the Muslim community as well as the non-Muslim communities at large in the West. Among non-gay people, in general, there are three categories. Non-gay people. There are three categories. Those who support homosexuality to various degrees, those who are on the fence, they're not sure, and then there are those who do not support homosexuality. And through strong media coverage, the gay community is gaining more supporters from the opposite side, as well as, the opposing people, as well as those on the fence, by promoting a perception of homosexuality being a natural act and prevalent in every community. As such, homosexuality has gained greater acceptance as an quote-unquote alternative lifestyle in the last 10 to 15 years in North America. Not only this mentality has affected adults, it is now affecting kids as a way of looking at the gay lifestyle. Under the topic of sex education, the public schools introduce and teach acceptance or tolerance for homosexual lifestyle in a neutral presentation. What is the historic, social, and scientific perspectives on homosexuality? What have past and recent philosophers said about homosexuality? For us Muslims, what is true Islamic and Qur'anic perspective on homosexuality? What about other faiths? Is homosexuality natural? Is it in one's genes? In this session and the next, we want to discuss this topic from the above perspectives, focusing, of course, on Islamic perspective, as well as a brief mention of other religions and their position. Plus, review of some of the well-known claims made by both sides, the supporters or pro-gay lesbian and the opponents, anti-gay lesbian. We will then provide responses to each claim. Historically, while West, especially Romans and Greeks, were fascinated by human body, as we have seen in their paintings and statues of half and full naked men and women, and some even admittedly gay encounters, homosexuality was still a taboo and for the most part not acknowledged, or you might say gays were in closet, so to speak. Even more so in the conservative or religious East, where homosexuality was considered an abomination and even punished, hence not many gays identified openly or came out, at least historically. However, there's no secret concerning the existence of Muslim homosexuality in history, although few and far in between. Even if in history it was a well-kept secret, the fact that gay Muslims normally kept their affairs hidden was a proof of their tacit self-admission that their orientation was not socially approved and or divinely blessed. This was also the case in the West, although perhaps to lesser extent. This is beginning to change. The contemporary homosexual activists who often portray a flaming presence in the workplace and public arena are now demanding their inclusion in churches, in synagogues, in mosques, religious schools, and centers. With the above brief description of current situation, first let's examine the narrative and position of homosexual community and their supporters versus their opponents' argument. Number one, many homosexuals and their supporters claim that homosexuality is a natural act. They cite a couple of animal species that engage in homosexual acts in order to prove that it is natural. And those animals do it as well. The opponents argue that several animal species also eat their young ones, and some even eat their own excrements, the feces. Does that mean humans should do the same? We will share our religious and philosophical perspectives on this later. Number two, another point, majority among the gay lesbian community and their supporters claim that homosexuality is in the genes. Therefore, they can't help it. Otherwise, who would want to be gay or lesbian? The opponents, on the other hand, argue that there is no such a thing and that there is no concrete evidence to prove that homosexuality is part of one's gene or genetic makeup. If it were so, we would not see cases of identical twins who share the same genetic makeup, however exhibit opposite sexual orientations. One becomes gay and the other not. Furthermore, if a homosexual could justify his behavior by referring to his genetic programming, what would prevent a person who commits incest or bestiality to also justify his behavior on similar grounds? The society would have to cater to such claims because, hey, it's genetic. They further argue that even if the ever so evasive gay gene is discovered someday, the fact that homosexual behavior must uncontrollably result from it will remain to be proven. Therefore, the opponents conclude that homosexuality is behavioral. gained behavior, i.e. gained behavior developed after people are born based on, things like the environment, exposure, upbringing, and conditions. These are the two most popular arguments and counter-arguments given by both sides. We might add philosophers like Plato and Aristotle regarded homosexuality as an unnatural act. For example, Plato refers to heterosexual intercourse as natural and same-sex sexual act as unnatural. Jewett, 1937, 636, page 418. Plato also writes about the origin of same-sex and opposite-sex urges. He condemns homosexual intercourse in both the Book of Law and the Republic. In his book, The Law, number 8, he rejects homosexual intercourse because it can render men unfit for marriage and because it is contrary to nature and a shameless indulgence. Fast forwarding to present time, the scientific community has also had a voice on this topic. Once in a while, in the past, there has been some indications by some limited studies as they have searched hard to see if such a gene exists by conducting few experiments with small samples of the population. And while initially said yes or maybe there could be a small percentage of gene pool, but for the most part, these experiments were rendered inconclusive or without any proof. We now focus on the latest and most famous experiment with a large number of samples published in 2019, just this year. We want to focus and spend some time on this part in detail, as it seems many people, especially among the non-religious, are counting on scientific data to prove the genetic claims. So, because a lot of the community, including the gay community itself and its supporters, rely on scientific data, we want to discuss this a little bit in detail, and we want to try to cover everything. We will quote the scientists who worked on or commented on this research from several reports and articles with references for those who want to study it further. An article in the Harvard magazine titled, quote, "There is still no gay gene," unquote, by Bennett McIntosh, published on August 8, 2019, said, quote, "There is no one gene for being gay. And though genes seem to play a role in determining sexual orientation and same-sex behavior, it's small, complex, and anything but deterministic." That is the conclusion of a paper by an international team of researchers co-led by Benjamin Neal of the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, published today in the journal Science. The team combed the genomes of more than 470,000 people in the US and the UK to see how genetic variants at millions of different places in the genome correlate with whether participants had ever had sex with someone of the same sex. This study, by far the largest such investigation of sexuality to date, was made possible by combining genetic and behavioral data from more than 400,000 people from UK's Biobank study and from 70,000 customers of the genetic testing company 23andMe, who opted in to having their data used for the research. Bear with me because this starts getting a little bit technical, but you will understand the conclusion of it. The researchers found only 5 genetic variants changes at a single site in the DNA sequence that correlated with same-sex sexual behavior. 2 of these had a larger effect only in males and 1 only in females. The effect of each variant is very small and inconsistent. For example, the author notes that in one of the male-specific variants, subjects who had a thiamine molecule, T, at a particular spot in the genetic sequence on chromosome 11 have a 3.6% likelihood of having had sex with other males, while subjects who had genuine guanine molecules, G, where there was a likelihood of 4% that they could have had sex with other males. The other 4 significant variants on chromosomes 4, 7, 12, and 15 showed similar or even smaller effects. Again, the article quotes here, quote, "It's effectively impossible to predict an individual's sexual behavior from their genome," said Neil, the director of genetics in Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research at the Broad and an associate professor in medicine at Harvard Medical School, HMS, during a Tuesday teleconference introducing the paper's findings. In fact, the team estimated that the genetic variants they studied could predict at best somewhere between 8 to 25% of the reported variations in the entire cohort's sexual behavior. And that the idea that a binary variable, i.e., whether a male has or has not had sex with another male might itself have a variation, may seem counterintuitive, but this number is analogous to estimating that 50% of the variation in a certain population's height can be attributed to genes. It refers to the differences within the population, not the genetic contribution to any individual's traits. The rest comes down to expansive realm of non-genetic. Again, this is all quoted by the article. The rest comes down to the expansive realm of non-genetic or environmental effects, which Neil said can range from anything from, in the uterus all the way to what happens next when you stand in a subway next to someone next morning. So, then the article continues, though it's not clear how any of the 5 significant genetic variants the study pointed to might act, some leave tantalizing hints at the biology of sexual attraction. One of the male-only variants, for instance, is associated with hormone-related effects like male pattern baldness and testosterone metabolism, while another is associated with several genes affecting the sense of smell. We know that smell has a strong tie to sexual attraction, but its links to sexual behavior are not clear, unquote, said co-author Andrea Ganna, an instructor at HMS and Massachusetts General Hospital from the Institute for Molecular Medicine in Finland. The study is in part a response to gay, lesbian, and bisexual people's curiosity about themselves, said Fah Satiropasanti, a senior scientist at 23andMe and co-author on the study, who is gay himself. Quote, I remember as a teenager trying to understand myself, understand my sexuality. I looked on the internet for the gay genes, unquote. Today, he noted, research and information about sex and sexuality is among the categories most requested by 23andMe's customers. Satiropasanti wasn't the only one looking at to the alleged gay gene for self-understanding or validation. Michael Bronsky, a professor of the practice in media and activism within the Committee on Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and author of A Queer History of the United States, says, the allure of a gay gene grew from the flourishing gay rights movement in the decades after the Stonewall riots in 1969. Conservative opponents of the movement claimed that homosexual acts are a choice. People choose to commit them, or people are seduced into the gay lifestyle. He explains, the clear counter was a refrain that still echoes today. Born this way, quote unquote. In 1993, Michael Hammer, PhD, then a researcher at the National Institute of Health, published results showing a correlation between male homosexual behavior and a cluster of genes called XQ28. At the tip of the location was at the tip of the X chromosome. Exactly which gene in this cluster may be involved has proven elusive. The current study found no significant association between the X chromosome and the same-sex sexual behavior. But the idea that a gay gene might lie somewhere in XQ28 or elsewhere was captivating. It was just interesting at the time. Genetics was gaining increasing authority and public attention. The Human Genome Project launched in 1990, Bronsky points out. So I was born this way, then became a genetic argument that there is something physical that made you have these attractions. And he's talking about what actually became talk of the town, and I was born this way. Not everyone has embraced the approach of legitimizing homosexuality through genetics, however. There are people who say it doesn't matter, that their rights shouldn't be depending on biochemistry, says Bronsky. Others have warned that the search for a genetic cause would pathologize homosexuality in the same way psychology did in the 20th century. Efforts by psychoanalysts such as Erving Bieber led to the inclusion of homosexuality in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1972. So Bronsky's concern here is the same thing that happened to American Psychiatric Association by Erving Bieber could happen in the biochemistry as well if we don't cite these on some solid scientific data. So then the article continues, in part because of this contentious history, said Neil, the study's author, who made an effort to engage with activists and advocates within the LGBTQ rights movement, including GLAD, using this feedback to adjust how they carried out their analysis and presented their work. A major focus of these discussion, he added, was the distinction between having sex with others of the same sex and being attracted to them, or identifying as non-heterosexual. A bisexual woman, for example, may only ever had sex with men, while a man who identifies as straight may nevertheless have sex with other men. If the gene identified in the study play a direct casual role at all, said Neal, it may in fact be because they are related to sexual attraction, but they could also act by making their possessors more open to new experiences in general, or more willing to risk doing something that's still stigmatized in many places. A lot remains unknown, the article says. Even after 51 researchers in 6 countries working with the genomes of nearly 500,000 people have announced that a handful of genes having something very small to do with same-sex behavior, at least in white Britons and Americans. I repeat, this was their statement. They have announced that a handful of genes have something very small to do with same-sex behavior, at least in white Britons and Americans. In another article titled, "No Single Genetic Cause of Same-Sex Sexual Behavior," quote unquote, written by Sarah Reardon and published on August 29, 2019 in Scientific American, says, quote, "Now a new study claims to dispel the notion that a single gene or a handful of genes make a person prone to same-sex behavior. The analysis, which examined the genomes of nearly 500,000 men and women, found that although genetics are certainly involved in who people choose to have sex with, there are no specific genetic predictors." In the new study, a team led by Brandon Zetek of University of Queensland in Australia mined several massive genome data banks, including that of 23andMe and the UK Biobank. They asked more than 477,000 participants whether they had ever had sex with someone of the same sex, and also questions about sexual fantasies and the degree to which they identified as gay or straight. The researchers found 5 single points in the genome that seemed to be common among people who had had at least one same-sex experience. 2 of these genetic markers sit close to genes linked to sex hormones and to smell, both factors that may play a role in sexual attraction. But taken together, these 5 markers explained less than 1% of the differences in sexual activity among people in the study. When the researchers looked at the overall genetic similarity of individuals who had had a same-sex experience, genetics seemed to account for between 8 to 25% of the behavior. The rest was presumably a result of environmental or other influences. The findings were published Thursday in Science. Then the same article continues, despite the associations, the authors say that the genetic similarities still cannot show whether a given individual is gay. Quote, it's the end of the gay gene, unquote, says Eric Willian, a geneticist at Children's National Health System in Washington, D.C., who was not involved in the study. Still, researchers welcome the idea. Quote, a lot of people want to understand the biology of homosexuality, and science has lagged behind that human interest, unquote, says William Rice, an evolutionary geneticist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who also was not involved in the work. Quote, it's been a taboo topic, and not that we're getting information, I think it's going to blossom. The study will not be the last word on the vexing question of what causes homosexuality, however. The article continues, in 1993, geneticist Dean Hammer of the U.S. National Cancer Institute and his colleagues published a paper suggesting that an area on the X chromosome called XQ28 could contain a gay gene. But other studies, including this new study and paper, found no such link. And Satrashopanti says that the new study is the final nail in the coffin for XQ28 as a cause of same-sex attraction. See, Fa Satrashopanti from 23andMe, who co-authored this paper, and he's gay himself, says that the new study is the final nail in the coffin for XQ28 as a cause of same-sex attraction. The study that was done back in 93. In another article written by Pam Bullock in New York Times on August 29, 2019, it said, again regarding the same research, despite its limitation, the research was much larger and more varied than previous studies, which generally focused on gay men and often those who were twins or were otherwise related. Quote, just the fact that they looked at women is hooray, said Melinda Mills, a professor of sociology at the University of Oxford, who wrote a commentary that Science published alongside the study. Article continues. In this study, researchers specifically identified 5 genetic variants present in people's full genomes that appear to be involved. Those 5 comprise less than 1% of the genetic influence, they said. And when the scientists tried to use genetic markers to predict how people in unrelated data sets reported their sexual behavior, it turned out to be too little genetic information to allow such predictions. Quote, because we expect the sum of the effects that we observe will vary as a function of society and over time, it will be basically impossible to predict one's sexual activity or orientation just from genetics, said Andrea Ganna, the study's first author, whose affiliations include the Institute of Molecular Medicine in Finland. The article continues, while many genetic variants tend to have the same effect in both men and women, Dr. Mills said 2 of the 5 variants the team found were discovered only in males and 1 was discovered only in females. One of the male variants might be related to sense of smell, which is involved in sexual attraction, the researchers report. The other male variant is associated with male pattern baldness and sits near genes involved in a male sex determination. The article said, quote, experts widely agree that the research was conducted by first-rate scientists, unquote. Again, quote, I kind of held my breath when I first saw the study. I thought, oh no, said Dr. Mills of Oxford, but it's the top geneticist and some of the top social scientists in the field working on this project. So if somebody was going to do it, I'm glad they did it, unquote. Yet another article titled No Gay Gene, Massive Study Homes In on Genetic Basis of Human Sexuality, written by Jonathan Lambert in Nature magazine, said, the findings, which are published in 29th of August in Science and based on the genomes of nearly 500,000 people, shore up the results of earlier, smaller studies and confirm the suspicions of many scientists. Listen to this. While sexual preference have a genetic component, no single gene has a large effect on sexual behavior. There is no gay gene, says lead study author Andrea Gana, a geneticist at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. MIT and Harvard in Cambridge, in Massachusetts. Okay, now, Gana and his colleagues also used the analysis to estimate that up to 25% of all sexual behaviors can be explained by genetics, with the rest influenced by environmental and cultural factors, a figure similar to the findings of smaller studies. Quote, this is a solid study, says Melinda Mills, a sociologist at the University of Oxford, UK, who studies the genetics and its basis on the reproductive behaviors. And then this other article, although the researchers have identified some of the SNPs involved in same-sex sexual behavior, they aren't sure what the genetic variants do. One is near a gene related to smell, which Gana says has a role in sexual attraction. Another SNP is associated with male pattern baldness, a trait influenced by levels of sex hormones, which suggests that these hormones are also linked to same-sex sexual behavior. Let me interject here about what I just read. You see, here they are reaching to say the least. One gene related to smell, which Gana says has a role in sexual attraction. Okay. And another one, male baldness, related to testosterone, a trait influenced by a level of sex hormones, which he suggests may be linked to same-sex behavior. However, we know sex hormones they don't determine the sexual behavior, or sex hormones, they belong to sexual behavior in general, not just homosexual behavior. So, at any case, that is all they can say. How does this even come close to same-sex behavior? I just want to point this out to the extent by which these scientists are trying to reach. Back to the article, the results demonstrate the complexity of human sexuality, says Gana. They also presented a challenge to the study researchers who knew that explaining nuanced findings on such a sensitive topic to the general public would be tricky. To ensure that their results are not misinterpreted, the study researchers worked with LGBTQ advocacy groups and science communication specialists on the best way to convey their findings in the research paper and to the public. Their efforts included the design of a website that lays out the results and their limitations to the public using sensitive jargon-free language. Ewan Burney, a geneticist and director of EMBL European Bioinformatics Institute near Cambridge, UK, applauds that effort. Quote unquote, "It's a communications minefield," he says, unquote. Although some researchers and LGBTQ advocates might question the wisdom of conducting this kind of research, Burney says that it's important. There has been a lot of sociological research on same-sex sexual behavior, he says, but this is an incredibly complicated topic. It's time to bring a strong biological-based perspective to the discussion, Burney says. Now, of course, there were many articles written on this topic and on this study that I did not mention here. I just mentioned a few samples and quotations. You can research and find out more about this topic and this research. The bottom line is no gay gene found directly or indirectly. No single genetic cause of same-sex sexual behavior. That's the bottom line. There is another article written by Marsha Mallory, published in Scientific American a while back in October 19, 2012. Of course, that is when this last study on genes had not come out yet. However, the article focused not just on the gene, but the brain functions. And besides her reliance on older data, she mentions some interesting points. The article is titled, "Is Homosexuality a Choice?" Then, in the article, she says, and I'm going to quote few quotations from it, "Is homosexuality a choice? Ask this question and you will probably receive one of the two responses. Yes, people choose to be gay. They are making an immoral choice which government should discourage. No, sexuality preference is biologically determined. Governments should protect gay people from discrimination because homosexuality is an unalterable aspect of their identity. They cannot change it. It's part of their DNA." Then she draws on two opposite narratives. Being gay, quote, "Being gay is bad. How wonderful is it that nobody has to be gay," unquote. Then the other one, quote, "Homosexual behavior should be allowed to take place. Isn't it fantastic that by an amazing coincidence, there is no way to stop it," unquote. Then she answers, "What if neither answer is right?" Then continues, "Perhaps sexual preference can be changed, and people have the right to engage in gay sex and have homosexual relationships if they choose to do so." And then she puts in parentheses the fourth option, that gay people have no choice but to be gay, but should be punished for it anyway, is morally unthinkable. Then she says, what does science tell us about sexual preference? We know from many twins and adoption studies that sexual preference has a genetic component. Again, I'm going to say, of course, here she is referring to the old study published in 1993 in the Journal of Science, which showed that families with two homosexual brothers were very likely to have certain genetic markers on the region of the X chromosome known as XQ28, as we talked about earlier, which the new study rejects. And the fact many identical twins show the opposite, one gay, the other one straight. So that's just the parenthesis I opened to interject. So she says, the old study also led to media headlines about the possibility of the existence of gay gene and discussions about the ethics of aborting a gay fetus. In other words, you find out the gene is defective by gay gene, and then you just abort the fetus. She then says, there have also been headlines about an alcoholism gene, which makes people become alcoholics, and a warrior gene, which makes people unusually aggressive. Then she says, genes can't control behavior completely, though. Though genes cannot control behavior completely. Genes regulate the production of amino acids, which combine to form proteins. The existence or absence of a protein can have an effect on things like alcohol tolerance or mood. She then draws on a very important conclusion. Affecting something is not the same as having complete control over it. Environment, and then she goes, like genetics. Of course, again, her article was published in 2012, which was long before the new study came out on the rejecting the genes. She says, environment like genetics play an important role in how our behaviors develop. She then gives example. Alcoholism runs in families not only because there is a genetic component to alcoholism, but also because children learn how to cope with stress by watching how their parents and their older siblings behave in stressful situations by drinking alcohol. Of course, here I'm going to add my note that there are many alcoholic families who produce non-alcoholic children. In fact, more so than the alcoholic children. So even though the genetic components may exist, we have no data to prove it, of course, it is a very small factor, if any. I do agree with her that most of such behavior is due to environment and upbringing. She emphasizes on the environment as she says, if you come from a culture where alcohol consumption is forbidden, it will be difficult for you to become an alcoholic, no matter how your body metabolizes alcohol. There are factors beside a warrior gene that contribute to aggression, she continues. Children learn to behave aggressively when they witness aggression being rewarded in their homes or surroundings. Again, I would add the same comment as I did on alcoholism here, that even if there is such a thing as a warrior gene, it is a very small factor, if any. Again, there are no studies, there are no proofs, and it seems it's almost entirely environmental. She adds, if you grew up in a family or as part of a culture where aggression was not well accepted, you would be less likely to be aggressive. You would learn from an early age how to control your aggressive tendencies. She then concludes, your environment affects your sexual and romantic relationships as well. Throughout history, marriages have been influenced by family relations and by economic needs. And here she makes an important point. She says, people adhere to cultural constraints of monogamy despite being attracted to people other than their spouses. In other words, she's saying it is natural for a man or a woman, a married man or a married woman, happen to be attracted to another person other than his or her spouse. But people will control themselves and stay faithful to their marriage. Attraction does not mean they cannot or should not control it. She then adds, your culture affects your views on homosexuality. In some societies, homosexuality is accepted. In others, it is frowned upon but tolerated. In yet others, it is a serious criminal offense, possibly punishable by death. Male homosexual behavior was expected in ancient Athens. Today, ritual male homosexuality plays an important role in some cultures in New Guinea. She then concludes, your upbringing can influence what you find desirable and what you find repulsive. What you have learned about homosexuality as you were growing up will affect whether you consider engaging in homosexual acts to be desirable or disgusting. Some people might argue that if you are genetically gay, but the thought of homosexuality nauseates you, then you just haven't accepted the fact that you really are gay. That argument is based on the assumption that sexual preference is purely biological, which, as we said, new study rejects. Therefore, it has no place in a discussion about the possible causes of homosexuality. She then moves on to the brain function and role and says, assuming there is a contribution from the brain, as she says, perhaps one day we will be able to adjust sexual preference via surgery, focusing on the particular regions of the brain that are associated with sexual preference, or via neural implants or training as a way to remove this behavior. She then continues her article. And her article under the subtitle, If Sexual Preference Can Be Changed. She says, even if gay people can never stop being attracted to members of the same sex, they can learn not to act on their desires. Note, this comes from a secular, liberal person, not a religious person. Because at the end of the article, she says everyone should have the choice to do whatever they want, right? So she says, even if gay people can never stop being attracted to members of the same sex, they can learn not to act on their desires. She then continues, people already learn to stop smoking, to give up certain foods, and not to cheat on their husbands or wives. If we define being gay as engaging in homosexual behavior, then people stop being gay as soon as they stop engaging in this behavior. And then, of course, at the end, she asks, should they stop? If they could, should they change their brains in order to make themselves straight? She asks. Then she answers, I believe that people have the right to engage in any behavior that they choose, as long as their actions do not harm others. And I believe that gay sex and gay relationship do not cause harm to anyone. Therefore, people who are gay by choice have the right to remain that way. Of course, there, and then she adds this in the parentheses and says, there are abusive and unhealthy gay relationships that should not be tolerated, just as there are unhealthy heterosexual relationships that should not be tolerated. She then concludes, if sexual preference can be altered, then people who support gay rights can't rely on the argument that gay people should be protected from discrimination, because gay people have no choice but to be gay, an argument that seems like an apology for homosexuality, as if homosexuality is a disease for which there is no cure. So these arguments, many of which seem valid, were published in the articles titled, Is Homosexuality a Choice? By Marcia Mallory, published in Scientific American back on October 19, 2012. Throughout these new articles we presented on study of genes, while there are gay doctors among the researchers, there are few doctors from LGBTQ community who cautioned against the study and said it gives ammunition to anti-gay, and then try to discredit all or part of the study. This shows there is a strong bias and influence from this LGBTQ community, not just in the political and social arena, but in the scientific community as well. Because of this influence and the fact some of the researchers are gay themselves, while they try to maintain their objectivity and keep their bias at bay, one can imagine there was probably more to say or share regarding the results, rejecting the notion of gay gene, supporting no gay gene. However, they did not or could not share further for obvious reasons. I would not be surprised to see a study someday to claim there is a gene or set of genes that are related to another gene or something associated to something else that is associated to sexual tendencies, hence concluding homosexuality is in the genes. Then you have people like Dr. Benjamin Neal, geneticist at Massachusetts General Hospital and the Broad Institute, who is gay himself, and says, quote, "It is effectively impossible to predict an individual's sexual behavior from their genome," unquote. So, either these researchers say there is no single or multiple genes that can be attributed or claimed as gay gene, or, as Dr. Neal says, it's effectively impossible to predict an individual's sexual behavior from their genome. Either way, it appears this says to gay lesbian community, don't go there. Don't go to genes argument. You can either agree with the critics of this research who say it's way too complicated or it's impossible to predict an individual's sexual behavior from their genome, or agree with the latest research that there is no single gene to attribute to sexual orientation and therefore lack of its control. Either way, you should park this gene argument, at least for now. So, now that we have covered the latest research-based opinions from the scientific community, as well as the other arguments outside science, we will stop here and pick up in the next session with the religious and philosophical perspectives, plus examine this lifestyle, natural versus unnatural, and make recommendations for the believers who have such desires and tendencies, inshallah. May Allah increase our awareness and knowledge. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Assalamu alaikum.